Jeff told me that he had done an album with Steve Lukather producing that has never come out. And I was like, wow, Steve Lukather, personally one of my favorite guitar players, melodically one of the greatest guitar players that ever lived, and just incredible. And I said, well, why won't it come out? And he goes, he's too much of a fan. I think that's another part of what we're doing is like, I think when you're trying to get artistic greatness, and we can argue this about a lot of artists that were in famous bands, go solo and don't seem to ever reproduce that thing again. And a lot of people discuss it's because, they start getting surrounded by sycophants who are just telling them everything they're doing is amazing. And so without picking the obvious artists that have all gone solo, they never quite have that four people in a room arguing and fighting about every idea and making something great, or the competition of two great songwriters in one band, like one person comes with an idea and then you should change it and put my bridge in. No, my idea is better. And all the obvious things like the Beatles, all of these great bands.
What's the best Paul McCartney album of the last 25 years, do you think? Say since 2000.
It's a tough one. I mean, I remember enjoying that Memory Almost Full album because it was the first time I had come back to pay attention. But the reality is like I listen to some of the stuff because I'm probably exactly like you. I'm friends with Brian Ray, so I will listen to stuff because I love Brian Ray. I like him as a person. I like his guitar playing, and so I'll check out the stuff. But I haven't listened to it in the same way necessarily I would listen to, Ram or you go back to some of the early solo stuff. Some of it is unfreaking believable. I mean, Band on the Run, I'm going to get people disagreeing with me, but Band on the Run could be a Beatles album. You throw in about 3 or 4 John Lennon songs in that, and that's one of the best Beatle albums ever.
Well, for me, I was going to say Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, which came out in 2003 or something like that. But it was I'm
going to go back and check it out.
Who was Radiohead's producer that did it with him?
Yeah, Nigel Godrich.
Nigel, right?
Yeah, Godrich. Yeah.
And they allegedly really butted heads on a lot of stuff, and it's got some. I mean, that what was that song? Jenny Wren, I believe, which is like as beautiful to me as Yesterday. There's some songs on that record that are just out freaking standing. Like it's just like a really, really great record. But allegedly there was a lot of fighting going on, and Nigel didn't let him get away with like, no, you're going to do that. Well, first of all, maybe it was probably difficult for the band, but I think I believe Nigel was kind of like, you're going to play everything on the record, like kind of, or as much as possible. Like I think he kind of because you wanted to get back to that. Yeah. And so there was this. And which he did, and it's, I don't know, man. I mean, that record, it really spoke to just the whole, like, yeah, occasionally it's a good thing to get in there and butt some heads and, like, have somebody tell you when, like, and not just be, because that's got to be a crazy difficult thing to do with somebody like Paul McCartney, It's just like, how do you do that?
Yeah, it turns into the Chris Farley interview, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Great.
You remember when you were, like, in the Beatles? Yeah, it's like
yeah, totally. Yeah,
I think a tip I would say to anybody that's working with artists of any stature, whether it comes down to being in the band or engineering or producing or mixing or anything, the thing I've learned is to be a fan of what the band is a fan of. Because if you understand where they came from, you can really, really connect. I've heard that from, like with Aerosmith, if you're a fan of the Yardbirds and Led Zeppelin, you're in because they love the Yardbirds. So when they're kids, they're hearing the Yardbirds for the first time going, I want to be in that. I want to be in that band. And that's why they put Aerosmith together, because they wanted to be the Yardbirds. And Led Zeppelin is obviously that in-between band and obviously huge Led Zeppelin fans. Joe loves Jeff Beck's playing. He loves Jimmy Page's playing. He may only be 5 or 10 years younger, but in that time when music was moving so rapidly, a 1967 rock album to a 68, to a 69, to a 70. I mean, we all know the evolution was moving so fast. You had John May on the Blues Breakers, kind of, 65, 66, isn't it? And then you've got Cream the year later. Then you got Hendrix at the same time. Then you got the first albums by Jeff Beck, or Truth. Oh, all of this is like, and Sabbath coming out, you know what I mean? Deep Purple, first couple of Zeppelin albums, all in the space of like 4 years. Like, Oh, well, what a time.
You make an amazing point. I remember talking to Kurt Busquera about getting the gig with Mick Jagger, and he did the Wandering Spirit album around, this is 92 or something like that, when Mick did that really cool record, actually. But it's a brilliant sort of strategy for auditioning. As he was in the hallway listening to all the other drummers go in and play with Mick, and of course everybody's playing, honky tonk or something, or playing, like doing I guess you'd get in there and Mick would be like, what song do you want to play, and they'd play. So he's like, what can I do to make myself stand out? So he got in the room, and Mick's like, okay, so what are we gonna do? What do you want to play? And he's like, let's play some James Brown.
Oh yeah.
And Mick just lit up. And he kicked off this groove. I don't know what song they played, but he kicked off a groove, and Mick starts dancing and stuff and sweating, and they just jammed for 10 minutes on some James Brown.
That's awesome.
You got the gig. be a fan of what they're a fan of. It was, yeah.
Yeah. It makes, you want to know that, we all want to know, we talked about doing this together, doing these kind of ideas, and we're like, we all realize we're sort of cut from similar cloths. And I think as you get older, I don't know about you guys may have all been the most popular kids at school. I certainly was, and I was like bookish and quiet. I grew into this personality. I was like super shy, really into art and music and all the things. Yeah, and music on a sort of different level, not just a haircut. I would like go back and read the album covers. I'd cycle to my local record shop and talk to the guy, shyly ask, when the new album by whatever art. I was that kind of kid. And so now we're adults, and this is our playground.
Yeah.
So we get to hang out, we might be that same kid in our school. So we're like one of 500 kids. And now, God bless the internet, we can all now we can join all those kids all over the world, and we can all, that's what I love. This is our playground. So Mick Jagger, he probably was that same kid. He was probably listening to like blues, of records that he was like beg-bollering and stealing and trying his hardest to get hold of. And so he found Keith Richards, and he found all these other guys, and they met, and their mutual love. So yeah, you go into a room, a guy gets up and plays something that he loves. It's like, here's another kid that I want in my playground. This is my playground, and I want to hang out with kids like me.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Definitely. Certainly seems like a lot more fun to get pulled back into that moment that turned you on originally about music, rather than have somebody come in that's going to kind of kiss your ass and try and impress you with playing your songs that you've done as good as they can or whatever. There's something about just like, oh, I feel like I'm 14 again all of a sudden with this guy playing drums, and this is why I started. It's brilliant.
I remember doing some pre-production with a band, and they were doing like these Chili Peppers grooves, and they were cool, sort of broken bass lines, and jagga, and the kind of a straight Chad but groovy kind of thing. And it was they were young and relatively inexperienced, but it was so stiff. It was so and they're like, well, we listened, and they talked about Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and they talked about all of these great albums, and I was like, that's cool. Go listen to the Meters. The Meters is where the Chili Peppers got that groove from. That's the reason why they covered Meters songs. Yeah. They grew up listening to punk rock and funk. So go and listen to punk rock and funk and pull those two things together, understand where it came from, then you will sound like your heroes, the Chili Peppers. So
this is the thing with, we could get into a whole Greta Van Fleet discussion or bands like that, but where I did an article for Premier Guitar a while ago where I was talking about is rock eating itself, because if the influence, the pool of influence, if you ask any young rock band that's trying to do a sort of throwback sound like that or something, it's like, what do you listen to? It's like, oh, Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin or something, and that's it. Well, what did Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin listen to? I mean, it's like, or the Beatles. I mean, you've got Paul's whole, like vaudeville kind of thing going on, and then John obviously bringing in the dirty rock and roll and Elvis and everything else and putting all that together, and George with his Indian music influences and stuff, and it's like that is what makes for really interesting rock bands, I think. Not just like, oh, well, we listen to Guns N' Roses, so now we're going to sort of be a band in that style.
Yeah.
It's like Sabbath had all kinds of interesting influences.
Charlie Gillett wrote a book called The Sound of the City, and he made that exact argument. He talked about And there's obviously lots of bands that are exceptions to this, so I'm not trying to completely destroy a genre or whatever, but he talked about how rock music got too incestuous. He said that he said exactly what you're talking about. He said like the Yardbirds, John Mayall and the Blues Breakers listened to blues, then and Zeppelin, Jeff Beck solo, obviously, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, all listened to blues and the bands around them to create what we consider to be, rock or heavy rock. And then Aerosmith listened to those bands, but he said then Motley Crue listened to Aerosmith, and there is the thing, exactly the same point that you made. It's incestuous. I can be a bit of a musical snob with this stuff. Sometimes I have kids working for me and I'm like, do you know who Robert Johnson is? And if they don't, I'm like, go and find out who Robert Johnson is. Because without Robert Johnson, there's no Rolling Stones. How many covers did they do of his? Love in Vain, one of their biggest songs. We think, if I say Cream to You Now, best guitar solo, you probably all would say Crossroads, another Robert Johnson song. It's like... Yeah, it's like it's in the blood, especially, growing up in Britain. That was like, it was in the blood of blues rock guitar players to know who Robert Johnson was, do covers and do. So I agree. You're making a massive point there. It's like, it's get out of the incestuous idea and go back to where it all came from.